presidency and of the conservative movement was that they had failed to institutionalize the sense of patriotism and pride that flourished in the 1980s. He said of his generation, quote, "We were taught very directly what it means to be an American, and we absorbed, almost in the air, a love for country and an appreciation of its institutions. If you didn't get these things from your family, you got them from the neighborhood, or you got a sense of patriotism from school. And if all else failed, you could get a sense of patriotism from the popular culture. The movies celebrated democratic values and implicitly reinforced the idea that America was special." All right, here we sit in 2020. The family's under enormous strain as an institution, and many doubt its utility or importance. We barely know our neighbors. And if you're relying on the American education system to teach about the greatness of America, well, let's just say that our K-12 schools are teaching the 1619 Project, and our universities are even worse. As for the movies and the art world, patriotism or conservative ideas are harder to find than socialists willing to give up their third houses. And that's before we get to the fake news media. So how can the ideas and the country that we cherish survive the left's long march, per the title of this panel, its rampage through our cultural institutions? And how can we get them back? That's why I'm so excited to introduce our panelists today. I'll go down the line here. Spencer Brown is a spokesman for Young America's Foundation, and in that capacity, besides appearing on Fox News and numerous other outlets, he spends a lot of time on college campuses across America, the front lines of the culture war. Saagar Enjeti is the host of Rising on Hill TV. I know he has some fans in the audience, along with his left-leaning colleague, Crystal Ball, which I believe now averages, and you can correct me, over 600,000 views an episode on YouTube.
Actually, 1,000,005. But
no, wow, okay, so Wikipedia's out of date, even from, so he and Crystal are also the authors of a new book on populism, The Populist Guide to 2020, A New Right and a New Left Are Rising. Finally, we have David Marcus. He's the New York correspondent for the Federalist. His work has also appeared in the failing New York Times, along with the non-failing New York Post, National Review, City Journal, and other outlets. Relevant to his role here on the panel, though, Dave is the former artistic director of Blue Box World, a Brooklyn-based theater project, and spent much of his pre-political life in the acting and theater world. So let's have a round of applause for our panelists. So Saagar, let's start with this. You and Crystal have a wildly successful, even Wikipedia's numbers are out of date in terms of how many views you get, internet-based political show. So, and I think the reason that at least one of the reasons it's been so successful is that you are allowing voices that don't find their way onto mainstream cable news, whether that's on the right and Fox or on the left with MSNBC and CNN. So, Is this democratization of media, how can conservatives use that to actually circumvent the mainstream media and introduce ideas that we just don't hear talked about that often?
The way that we can do it is by building an alternative. Because for so long, what Donald Trump showed is that instead of whining about how the mainstream media teaches you or how they treat you and trying to play ball and giving them scoops and the amount, people would be shocked in this room to see the amount that the conservative establishment kowtows to people in the mainstream media, bringing them then into these backroom meetings and trying to get them to write favorable things. And they screw you every single time. And nobody ever learns. They go, oh, well, the story was only 75% bad instead of 100% bad. And you know what we did instead on my show? We actually just built an alternative instead of whining about a headline or saying, oh, they're biased against us. Yeah, they're biased against us. They always will be biased against you. The power of the internet. What did Trump do? He just tweets. He just tweets and circumvents them. He doesn't call them in. One of the biggest things that happened in media that showed how truly powerless they are was the day of the Access Hollywood tape. The Access Hollywood tape, any single other politician would have had to bunker down, call George Stephanopoulos, sit for a 45-second or 45-minute interview. They would have cut it so he looks terrible, the lighting, etc. Trump shot his own video and then just put it out. And they all had to play it on cable news over and over and over again because he had the power. they didn't have the power anymore. That's what the internet has given us. And that's why we should be concerned about social media companies and the way that they are censoring content or not. That's why we have to understand that the new battleground is not on the cable airwaves, but it's on the internet, because that's the only thing that gives us power. It gives us the ability to build something new and feature voices that don't necessarily have the time. And look, cable is an outlet, is a way in which, I grew up on, I'm sure many here enjoy, but it's not conducive to a longer conversation. So the ability that I have on the internet is I have unlimited time. I'm on YouTube. There's no limit to the amount of time that you can upload on something. So if I want to have a 20-minute conversation, I'll have a 20-minute conversation. And it's that I think that has really been able to break through and has contributed to the success. But the main thing I want to get across is that instead of whining, build something by yourself.
That is the theme of this panel, or I hope to. But so part of the problem, I think, with the fact that the traditional newsrooms are so far left, the folks who work for the social media companies are pretty uniformly left. A lot of this originates in the universities, right? It's because our professional class all go through, indoctrination through K-12, and then they go off to universities to get degrees, get massively into debt doing so, the universities are the engines that are pumping out a lot of these sort of SJW ideas. So what is it like when you visit college campuses? Are the scenes we see on Twitter clips the average? Are they unusual? Are people able to have conversations? And then if they're not, what should we do about it? What can we do about it?
Well, I think there's sort of two different ways in which the left in this case will try to control what goes on college campuses. I think a lot of conservatives especially just take for granted the fact that campuses are liberal and they're always going to be that way. And so what we continue to see is that when the left is trying to shut down, whether it be conservative speech or just any speech that runs against their orthodoxy, they have two ways to do that. And so you have this direct confrontational opposition, which is what you see when universities will do things like ban a speaker outright or disinvite them, when they will allow their campus to be completely overrun by leftist thugs or Antifa or whoever it may be. And that's what you see on Twitter. That's what you see on the nightly news. That's what you see on cable news. You see kids getting, sucker punched in the face at Berkeley, and you're like, oh, that's problematic, but surely that's not every university. But then there's a second way that universities do this, and it's more, I think, nefarious, because the way they do it is just through the bureaucracy of these universities. And so when you look at them, you see that they have these policies in place, some of which are unwritten, some of which are vague, some of which they only apply to conservative speakers. And that's where a lot of our lawsuits come out of. So if you look at, for example, we sued UC Berkeley about 2 years ago, and the problem there was they told 3 speakers in a row, all conservatives, that they couldn't speak on certain parts of campus that were close to the center and where the main action was. They told the speakers that they couldn't be there after dark because that was too dangerous to have a conservative on campus after dark. And then they told the students they couldn't even advertise the events on campus because if you advertise a conservative is coming, the left will predictably get all riled up, and then that's not safe. And so it's these policies that I think are a way more nefarious way of doing it, because students, they don't know how it runs. These universities like UC Berkeley are run basically like the federal government is. They're not efficient. They have all these layers of bureaucracy. It's just absurd what students have to go through in order to try to have the same equal rights as their leftist peers. And so I think that's where we see the bigger problem come in, because you don't see stories about that on the nightly news that often. You don't see stories about policies that are unwritten, because most students never even get to the point of discovering that. And I think for conservatives especially, this is a field in higher education where we have notched some victories. We beat UC Berkeley, we beat the University of Florida, we beat Kennesaw State University. We're suing the University of Minnesota right now, and we've secured these equal speech rights, equal access rights. But if no one's willing to speak on those campuses still, and nobody's willing to speak up and say I'm a conservative and here's what I believe, then how is that any better than when the speech was banned in the first place? And so we have to galvanize conservatives to actually be willing to stand up and speak. And it's not just about courage. We were talking about it before this panel, and just a conservative going into a debate on a college campus today is at such a disadvantage because of all the social capital and all of the risk to themselves personally for getting into that debate. It's never going to be a level playing field, and that's hugely problematic. And so you can hold them accountable through the courts, but there's a huge other part to that, and that is finding conservatives who are willing and inspired and able to stand up and share our ideas, because if they don't, the rights are just unused.
So let me follow up a little bit on this. So an interesting thing happened 3-4 years ago in public opinion polling. For decades, Pew does some of these long-term polls over time. For decades, Americans overall, there was a strong majority of Americans who thought that the universities, they just asked a simple question, are the universities good or bad for the country? And for a long time, there was a consensus that they were good. In the last 4 years, that's flipped upside down. And that's driven primarily by Republicans and independents who are looking at some of the videos that YAF is putting out about the riots because people can't hear that Ben Shapiro thinks that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. Public policy wise, how do we catch up the Republican Party to where their voters are, which is these universities are a pernicious influence over the whole. There are exceptions, blah, 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 blah. But as a whole, the university system, Americans are now saying this is bad for the country. How do we catch up Republican policy to that? And what would that look like?
Well, the problem with student loan debt specifically in that equation is it's $1.5 trillion now that is hanging over the country. And it's treated just like the national deficit and the national debt, where we talk about it all the time, but what are we actually going to do about it? What are we going to do to address the fact that there's this much money owed by people who have women's studies and whatever else degrees that obviously aren't going to get gainful employment? And that goes back to this idea that the equation of higher education and why it's not a good thing for the American people is this idea that you need to get this 4-year liberal arts degree in, again, women's studies or gender studies or whatever it is, and that you're somehow going to have gainful employment when you come out on the other side and be able to pay back, $50, $60 or more $1,000 in student loan debt, and that's just not going to happen. And so I think the better place to sort of look at this and analyze it is, why are these universities charging so much in the first place? And the answer, like most things, it's the fault of the federal government, right? They went in and they subsidized these educations, where any university, like any business or somebody trying to make a buck, will look and say, if it costs X to do this and the government will give me X plus Y, how much more can I charge in order to get out of the American people through the taxpayers in order to get that money? And they use it, of course, to do more leftist things. So they open these diversity centers. They open all these new programs on their campuses. We just recently exposed at the University of Virginia, they just opened a new multicultural student center. You may have seen the video last week where a black student stood up and said, there are too many white people in here. You have the entire campus to be in. You can't stand in here. You need to be cognizant of the fact that you're taking up our space. And obviously that multicultural student center is not actually multicultural if they're telling students that they can or cannot be there based on the color of their skin. And that's all money to build that facility and staff it from the extra funds that they get from student loan payments, because they know students can rack up all this debt and the university isn't paying any more to deliver it.
So I just want to emphasize one great point that you said. We are paying for this expansion of the university system. Taxpayers back 92% of student loans. And as I like to say, I would really like to see the situation in which a student who wants to study gender studies at Brown University has to walk into Wells Fargo to ask Wells Fargo to give them $150,000 to study, queer feminist literature. Wells Fargo is going to look at that bottom line a little bit differently than the federal government does. But Dave, I want to turn to you. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about what happened when you essentially started writing? You spent all your life in this theater world as an actor and a director and a writer, and then you wrote some pieces about your political opinions. So what happened then?
It didn't go over that well. No, yes, I became pretty vocal about my conservative beliefs because, and this really ties into the question of colleges. It makes me think of the Woody Allen's line that everything that our parents told us was good for us is actually bad. Red meat, the sun, college, and I spent 15 years. I did dozens and dozens of productions. I worked with hundreds of people. I never worked with a conservative. Not one. I mean, at least as far as I know, maybe there were some who, just kept it to themselves, as I did for a long time. And I started to ask myself, why? How can this be? And the answer really does come back to the academy, because if you go back to the pre-1960s and you think about, how did you become an actor? How did you become a director? How did you become a playwright? It was basically sort of an apprenticeship situation. You would show up at a theater company, you would show up in Hollywood, you weren't going to school for it. Starting in the 1960s, Now you're going to Yale Graduate School for drama. Now you're going to NYU Graduate School for drama. Now the Academy is controlling that development process. Not only that, but theater itself, which is the feeder into Hollywood and television, stopped being for profit. And all of these theater companies became not-for-profit theater companies. So they were no longer beholden to the audience. They didn't need the audience dollars. They need the dollars of the NEA. They need the dollars of granting institutions. They need the dollars of individual donors. And all of those dollars are also being subsidized by the taxpayer because they're tax deductible. So you ended up with this absolute feedback loop where there just is nothing but progressive hegemony within this world. You know, there's one famous conservative playwright. Somebody's going to know his name, right? David Mamet, right? David Mamet. And when David Mamet came out as a conservative, one of the things he said that was fascinating was, I'd just never seen this stuff before. You know, it was his rabbi who showed him some books, and he said, wow, this is interesting. I had no idea this stuff existed. You know, reminds me of my Irish great-grandmother had 15 kids, and she didn't get out of the house a whole lot. But when my Jewish dad and my Irish Catholic mom started dating in the early 70s, the families were a little dicey about it. But as far as my great-grandmother knew, there were Irish Catholics, there were Polish Catholics, there were Italian Catholics. She just assumed he was Jewish Catholic. And you know, and that's what it is, because of course everybody's a Catholic, everybody's a progressive, right? And so we need to find ways as conservatives to be developing artistic talent that we're not doing now, because the progressives are doing it at such a clip that it's unbelievable.
So let's follow up on that. You know, how can we develop, I don't want to say conservative art, because that usually ends up being awful. It ends up being showcased to the already converted and doesn't leave sort of this room, right? How can we encourage more artistic production of things not that are conservative, but that reflect deeper timeless principles, the reality? I mean, Mamet famously said, you know, I didn't know my plays were conservative. I didn't know what conservatism was, but I realized my plays were conservative because they reflected reality about human nature and about people. I mean, how do we grow the farm team so that, how do we get the next David Mamet? Because Mamet had to be a leftist to get through all those gatekeepers that you just said, and then had his conversion. How do we make sure that a conservative playwright or painter or filmmaker today is able to get to the place where Mamet is today?
I mean, a good start would be to defund the NEA. You know, I think, but that doesn't solve the problem, because you still have this problem of the development of talent is going through this progressive meat grinder constantly. So I really think what we should be trying to do is present conservative ideas to these students. I mean, one idea that I've had that knock on wood, there's a funder who I think is doing something along these lines, but it's very simple. If you offer a $10,000 prize for a 10-minute play based on a conservative reading, make it Buckley, make it Burke, make it whatever it is, you know. Every graduate and undergraduate playwriting student in the country is going to apply for that because it's $10,000 for a 10-minute play. None of these students will have ever seen anything like this before. You're not going to change all of their minds, but you're going to open them up to something. And maybe some of them are going to be like Mamet and say, wait a minute, I've never even considered this perspective before. So I think those are ways that conservatives can try to get inside of this system and just expose the cultural content creators to ideas that they honestly just don't know exist.
So what I'm hearing, though, from all three of you, right, is we have a set of gatekeepers who have varying levels of power. In media, their power seems to be waning. It seems in art and in the universities, we're going to have to actively do something as conservatives through policy, through suggestions like yours, Dave. And I'll open this up to any of you who wanted to speak on it. You know, to the extent that these gatekeepers are not naturally falling behind or becoming obsolete, what can conservatives do to either speed up that process where it's happening or introduce it in industries where it's or spheres where it's not happening yet, and where these institutions and gatekeepers still maintain a death grip on public opinion?
I think the only way to do this is to change the incentives. That's what, whenever I said build it, it's because if you show somebody that there's a commercial incentive in order to cater to conservatives, then they're going to show that there's a market for those types of products. That's how you break the strain. I mean, in terms of education, in terms of culture, like what you're talking about is a massive talent pipeline that has been built and taken over by the left. So the right, look, I think $10,000 incentives are great, but we have to start from a way bigger structural moment, which is that the university itself, the way that these high level, anybody who attends one of these arts institutions are probably, and working in New York City probably goes to like 5 different schools. Those schools need to know that if they're going to discriminate against conservatives, that something is going to happen to them. And to do that, I think we have to start believing in public policy again. I think that for a long time that we all just decided that we would adopt this libertarian ideology of, we're just gonna not do anything and then let the left continue to creep up its power. And turns out that whenever, as conservatives from a cultural point of view, we hold the majoritarian position in this country. And maybe the government should use its public policy to act in our interests against people whose entire mission is to destroy you in life. And they take over the government, they take over the commanding heights of our culture, and we just tend to let it happen over and over again. And I'm sick of it. That's part of the project that I've tried to advance.
If I can just add one thing onto that, I think another important part of that is that we have to be thinking about free marketplaces as opposed to the not-for-profit system. One thing to think about is there is one form of performance narrative art that still operates under the old rules, and it's stand-up comedy. Right, you don't go to college for stand-up comedy. There are courses, but that's not how you do it. The way you become a stand-up comedian is you show up at the club, you put your name down in the book, you stand up in front of people. It's absolutely terrifying. I've done it. And either they laugh or they don't. And if they laugh and they keep laughing, that's how you climb up. And what do we see in stand-up comedy? We see Dave Chappelle refusing to be woke. We see Jerry Seinfeld criticizing cancel culture on campus. We see Bill Burr saying, don't freak out over Trump. What we see is a much broader ideological spectrum than we see anywhere else in the arts. And it's because they aren't being chosen by these gatekeepers. They're being chosen by the people in the audience who either laugh or they don't.
So for each of you is expert on a particular sector, right, of a cultural institution. So for each of you, do you think, there are 2 routes, right? If conservatives want to take back these institutional heights, the way, Saagar, you're talking about, in each case, right, the question is going to be, you talked about the pipeline. Is it possible for us to seize the pipeline? Seize the means of production, if you will. But is it possible for us to seize the pipeline and take it over? Or do we have to destroy the pipeline and build a new one for conservatives or for just people who are heterodox in their ideas? So Spencer, if you want to start it off, but I want to hear from each one of you if you think it's possible to win the battle within the institution, or we need to collapse that old institution and build perhaps a new one.
Well, I think whether or not it actually collapses when we go after it is kind of up to the institution, especially when it comes to higher education. We've seen at a number of universities where just absolute chaos has broken out that there is a cost to the bottom line for these institutions. And I think one of the best examples that we've seen, just because of the amount of time that's passed since this happened, is at Mizzou, where if you remember, this journalism professor, Melissa Click, was running around screaming, "We need muscle over here," to get student journalists off the quad during this protest. And that is a school that has paid serious financial consequences for the way it handled that situation. They've had to shut down some residence halls. They have had to limit the course offerings. They've had to do some stuff to limit the scope of their sports programs, all because students are actually realizing, or maybe their parents are more likely, that that's not a good place for their students to go and get a supposed education. And I think we've seen at other schools, sort of in the immediate response, this pipeline of money to these institutions specifically, when we had Ben Shapiro speaking at the University of Minnesota in the wake of the university blocking taking him and basically shoving him off to what's called the cow campus on another side of the river, we had 2 major donors to the university see this happening and send us letters saying, I just let the university know that I've taken them out of my will. They're not in my estate plan. I'm not going to support this. And so if you look at these institutions, they are supported by a lot of these alumni and trustee boards. And those alumni often don't know what's going on college campus. And when they see that they're treating conservative speakers literally like second-class citizens, they don't want to leave their legacy to an institution that treats people like that. And so that's a way that we can interrupt that pipeline of all the money, show schools there are consequences, and if they don't sort of modify their behavior, then they face collapse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you don't need to destroy the pipeline. You just need to let the pipeline know that there are consequences for when they discriminate. And I don't think it necessarily needs to just come from the individual donors. I don't know why. I mean, the left uses its government power and its seizure of government power in order to go after conservative institutions time after time after time. And it used to be in this country that whenever Hollywood was making a movie and they were afraid that it might offend people in the religious community, they would bring in people from the religious community to the doors. They would say, hey, does this there would be a bargaining process, and the religious community could tell them, hey, if you don't listen to what we say, we're going to boycott you. Now, they don't care what we think. They don't care what the religious community thinks. They don't care what conservatives think. Look at Nike and the Kaepernick thing. They got more profitable. If you look at, even more and more, what they have decided is that all conservative belief whatsoever is not tolerated within culture. And so from my perspective, you don't need to destroy the pipeline. You just need to make sure that the pipeline knows that we've got people and we've got power and that we're willing to exercise our power. That's, if I can hammer home one thing, it's that conservatives need to believe in power again and in exercising it in order to make sure that people know that we exist and that this is our country too.
I think we have to destroy the pipeline. At least, maybe not on the university level, but in terms of the arts, I think we really do. I think we need to starve this beast to death, because the way, there's a story from 1985 that, the little NEA grant, this Eureka Theater Company in San Francisco gets this little NEA grant, allows them to have a playwright in residence. This guy named Tony Takani, who is the artistic director of Berkeley Rep now, and a guy named Oscar Eustis, who is the artistic director of the Public Theater. You might remember that's the theater company that had the version of Julius Caesar where Donald Trump was getting stabbed to death. Back in 1985, they get this grant, and they know this professor at NYU, and they say, well, who do you think? Like, do you have anybody? And they get, and this is reporting from the LA Times. The professor says, yeah, I got this guy. He completely shares your left-wing leanings. Like, you'll love him. He goes out there. Guy's name is Tony Kushner. The play that he develops is Angels in America, which is one of the most seminal moments in terms of sort of changing the conversation on gay rights. 15 years later, he's commissioned to write the screenplay for the major motion picture about the first Republican president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Tony Kushner is an avowed communist. That's how this happens. And so, we think, oh, who cares about the NEA? Who cares about theater? Who cares about these little things? That's how this happens. And if it wasn't going to be Tony Kushner, it was going to be somebody else, because there's a million other people to pick from. So if we don't take this money away and start making these artistic organizations actually pay for themselves, actually think about what do audiences want, then none of this is going to change.
So just one more question for all three of you from me, and then hopefully, I don't know if we have a mic that can be run in the audience, but otherwise you guys are just gonna have to stand up and yell. It's not a problem for me. I'm a loud person, but we'll take some questions from the audience. So I want to hear from each of you. What is the most troubling trend you see in your respective sectors? And then conversely, what is the most hopeful trend that you see in the university, right? In media, in the arts? What are the most hopeful trends? What are the most depressing ones?
Oh boy. I'm an optimist. So I'm going to start with the good news first. I think the thing that we've seen specifically since Donald Trump took office is the willingness of conservative students to actually engage in the fight. You know, like I was talking about before, if you have the right to speak, but you're not willing to speak, then what good is the right in the first place? But what we've seen is that young people, especially on college and now even more so on high school campuses, because they realize that this nonsense starts even younger than ever before, they're willing to stand up. They're willing to take the risk because they do see that there is often a really great reward. You know, there's a ton of BS that they have to get through in order to speak up as conservatives. But what they find is that there are more conservatives and more people who think like them than they realize. And it just takes one person standing up to get out there and say it before people realize, hey, it's not completely absurd for me to believe this. There's somebody over there who looks pretty normal. I can stand up and join them in that fight. So that's what's been really good to see. And we see that in the number of YAF chapters we have across the country, the number of student groups who want to host speakers on their campus. People are less afraid than before because they realize that going along to get along doesn't get them anywhere. They need to actually stand up and fight if they want to have any rights at all. And I think the thing that's most troubling is just the way universities completely use doublespeak in order to talk in terms when it comes to treating conservative students. Throughout our entire lawsuit against UC Berkeley, their spokesman continued to go on TV and talk about how they were the home of the free speech movement. And that may have been true back in the 60s or whenever, and that's fine for them to claim, but they can't use that to say that now they're this bastion of free expression when they have unwritten policies that ended up getting them stuck in federal court and having to pay YAF $70,000 in addition to changing their policies. But the way they act is just completely hypocritical and like they're somehow holier and better than everybody else because they're these institutions of higher learning when really they're just the worst places where free speech goes to die.
I'm going to start with the troubling part because I'm a cynic. And the most troubling thing that I see in our society right now, this pertains especially to media, is the alliance between the richest people in this country and the people who hate this country the most. And I cannot think of a better example than the New York Times 1619 Project. You've had a project which is explicitly designed and aimed at kids in order to teach them that the history of the United States is inextricably racist, that it is racist to its core, that there's really nothing we can do about it, and it is designed because the richest people in this country want everybody in this country to hate each other along race lines so we don't start asking questions about their power, about their dealings with China, about how they treat average American workers. And essentially what has happened is that you have an alliance now where the Shell Gas Corporation, is sponsoring Black Lives Matter or the 1619 Project seminars because they know that's how they can buy off the left from asking real questions about how they do business and what they actually think about the United States. Now, in terms of a optimistic trend, the internet. I think the internet is opened up doors for all of us. I mean, I know conservatives should be rightfully worried about the new gatekeepers online, but the truth is that this is what has given us the ability to bypass the mainstream media. They don't control the narrative anymore. Donald Trump is president of the United States because of the internet. And for now, they can't silence you. They can try, but there's usually going to be at least some path forward for you to get around them and to reach the masses, which is, I think conservatives should remember, is that they hold the majoritarian position in this country. No matter how much you are told otherwise by the media, and the fact is you don't have representation in the mainstream. We do have representation in the population. Get online and go and follow and build things that actually cater to us.
Yeah. I want to apologize for having written for the New York Times. I was like that girlfriend who, I was like the girlfriend who like thought you could change him. You know, it wasn't going to happen. Really didn't work out. So I'm going to answer both questions with the same answer, which is cancel culture. So in the arts, this has been, you know, a huge deal over the past 10 years or so. Like every day, like somebody's getting canceled for something.
Yeah, well, I mean, you were telling me this afternoon, right? There are people who just do not speak to you, will not shake your hand, who you knew for years.
Yeah, no, there was, I produced this one guy's play, and there was a thing where, like, you know, I saw him after I started writing for the Federalist and expressed support for Trump, and, you know, I went to shake his hand, and he said to me, you know, I would, but I have a cold, which I guess with the coronavirus might make sense, but this was, you know, 2 years ago or something, and then... Unless he saw it coming. No, and then after, like, we're both seeing actors who we know backstage, and he's, like, giving everyone hugs. You know, and so it's just like, whoa, man, like, that's a heavy level of, like, disdain to be like, I can't shake your hand because you support the president. But what's happened with cancel culture has started to swing back a little bit, because the canceled are starting to say, I don't accept this. And they're starting to find each other. And they're starting to create their own networks in which to create this, sort of crazy art and crazy books and crazy poetry and all kinds of stuff. And this is really emerging. It's emerging in places like New York and in Toronto and Montreal. And so for me, that's the positive thing, is that, even J.K. Rowling recently, like, she got in trouble with this sort of trans thing. And this time she didn't bend the knee. This time she said, no, this is what I think. And it turns out when you do that, they don't have any other shot left in the barrel. They're done. And so I think people are learning that, and that's what I see as the positive trend that's moving forward.
All right, so if you have questions, maybe put up your hand and I'll come to you. How about this gentleman in the front, if you could stand up and then yell.
Just to pick up on Saagar's point about vote capital, we've all seen corporations.
I'll repeat the question into the mic.
We've all seen corporations kowtow to the latest cultural cause du jour on the liberal side. Why don't they feel the need to do it on the conservative cause du jour? They never seem to perceive any kind of risk from ignoring things that conservatives care about, even though, as you said, those are often majoritarian views. So why the difference?
So just let me repeat the question so everyone can hear. He was asking why corporations so often, if there's 20 mad people on Twitter from the left, they're willing to bend the knee and kowtow to it, but they don't care at all about ticking off the majoritarian position of conservatives in this country.
The reason why is because they've bought off the conservative establishment. And the conservative establishment doesn't want to fight back on the interests of the GOP base that continues to put them in power. And that's why they all voted for Donald Trump in 2016, because he was the first guy to actually stand up and fight for less immigration in this country after so many politicians said they were going to do it over and over and over again. And then they come up here and they cut the corporate tax cut, but they don't do anything actually in favor or to the wants and needs of the people that voted for them in the very first place. But things are changing now, so don't be terribly cynical like me.
Do either of you guys have want to answer the question about that the gentleman asked or not?
I think he nailed it.
Okay, so let's just keep going this way. You and the Democrat, Republican, whatever that is. Sure.
Nuance,
bro. He's a famous guy.
So Trump signed an executive order on campus free speech. When do you think we can expect to see some enforcement on that, and why haven't we seen enforcement on that?
Yeah, so
Let me just repeat again. So Trump signed an executive order on free speech several months ago. When can we expect to see any enforcement of that or any outcome of that?
Yeah, so it was actually almost exactly a year ago that he announced he was going to do that from the stage here at CPAC last year. And then he had an event at the White House where he signed it a few months ago. And the problem with relying on government to do things is you must then trust and rely on the government to do things. And so in this case, the executive order basically is tying federal funding in the form of research grants and other things to these institutions to their support for the First Amendment and whether or not they uphold free expression. And unfortunately, it is incumbent upon, I believe it was 8 or so federal agencies to put teeth on this executive order as to how they would determine compliance with the First Amendment or free expression and what the penalties would be. And unfortunately, as of yet, we haven't had any real instances where a university has been, caught in a situation like this. But the fact that the executive order exists has been cited in several complaints and demand letters that we've sent to universities saying you need to comply because you could face damages and the power of the purse from this.
So I'd only add, maybe take my moderator hat off for just 1 second, because I do education policy over at Independent Women's Forum, where I work, by the way. I should have said that in the beginning. And say that part of the problem is it's an executive order, and there isn't actually an enormous amount that the executive can do on this. What really needs to happen is Congress needs to tie, and there is a rider in Congress, but this goes back perhaps to Saagar's point about the current Republican Party or the conservative establishment. That was jettisoned in favor of a toothless resolution in favor of free speech rather than actually tying financial consequences to it. But that was something that was floated in Congress and then was quietly dropped in Congress.
Shocker.
Okay, I'm just gonna go kind of like this. There's the older gentleman with the glasses, right? You're looking at, sorry, I have to describe people. I don't know how else to do this.
What do I tell my grandchildren deal with the college professor who controls their grades and is trying to shift them off to the left.
I think that was loud enough, but just for the recording. So what advice should we give to college students who are facing a professor who's super left and they want to get a good grade and that professor controls their grade? What should they do? Should they write essentially what they believe, or should they kowtow to what the professor wants and make sure that they get that A?
There are two arguments on this. Do you care about what you get out of college on the other side since you're spending money on it? Or do you care about, kind of making the biggest stand for conservative ideas in the classroom? And it's a question that we get all the time. We get emails basically every day from students saying, hey, my professor graded me down because I said what I believed and not what they wanted me to believe. What do I do about this? And unfortunately, these professors have the power in this situation, right? I mean, you can argue with your administration, you can run it up the ranks saying, I think I was discriminated against because I wrote a conservative idea, but it's incredibly difficult to make that case to a liberal administrator or a liberal faculty. And so it really does depend on what are they trying to get out of the educational experience. And so for me, I went to a private Christian school, and so I thankfully never had to make that choice. But looking back, I wish I had gone to a liberal school and had been the one to make a stink, because now in my job, I travel to college campuses all over the country with conservatives, basically making the biggest stink possible in the name of making a stand for free expression. And so that's something that I definitely would have done. But it's also something you don't want them to throw away their future chance at a career because they have horrible grades through college because they were making what they believed and what we know to be the right thing. You don't want them to throw away their future just for the sake of standing up to a leftist professor.
If I can just throw out, I would tell your grandson or granddaughter to send them articles from the Federalist. Not just also other, but seriously, like I think a lot of times when we're trying to influence, especially young people, you're getting, weird memes or emails or whatever it is. And I mean, find the things that really affect you and make you think about things in deep ways and send that to them. And whether they do choose to then be the person who makes a stink about it, or, I mean, let's face it, probably 80% of college students don't care about this one way or the other. There's 20% who are battling with each other. So if your grandkid is one of those 80%, just make sure that you're exposing these ideas to them, and it really goes a long way.
So I would add some practical advice. So first of all, this is a real phenomenon. In fact, there was just a study that came out that I'm sure you're familiar with, Spencer, that showed that matched students in terms of GPA and SAT scores coming into university, that very conservative students, or those who identify as conservative, have lower GPAs, which if you're matching people on the front end to make them roughly equivalent in terms of academics, there is some kind of, or at least there's a good argument that there is a larger effect of discrimination. But some practical advice, and it may be a little less, it might be even harder than when I was in college 10 years ago, but I used to scan all of the classes and look for the code words, right? Look for through the lenses of race, class, and gender. And avoid those classes even when they were on things that I was really interested in, because that's code when the professor writes up the description, and then go ahead and look at the professor's CV and read the things he or she has written, and you can still find, and it might be that you then have to take more esoteric or less interesting courses to you, but I think that if you're concerned about your grades and you don't want to sacrifice your principles, sometimes that means, unfortunately, you're going to have to read, Locke on your own, and you're going to have to take a class about something that might interest you less because the professor doesn't write race, class, and gender in the course description. All right, we'll continue going. So you gentlemen right here, yeah.
So I was listening to somebody speak, and he was talking about how there's a lot of anti-defamation leagues for different groups. And so in Hollywood, certain movies come out because there's only a limited number of bad characters you can pull from. There have been people who tried to make movies where there was a gay person who was spreading AIDS. That got shut down by the HRC or theirs, or there was a Muslim character was a terrorist and Kara came in, or an Italian person was in the mafia. Many of those get shut down because of the anti-defamation leagues. And so what you're left with is Christians. You can go after priests, you can make them the bad guys, you can make police the bad guys, you can make economic conservatives or business people the bad guys. There's only a limited pool to put from. So I was wondering about anti-defamation leagues and the roles that they have in what we end up getting to be able to see. For countries that lose wars, they don't have anti-defamation leagues, so you see a lot of those things.
So I'll repeat the question. So we see anti-defamation leagues for various protected classes or groups or ethnicities that then get angry at production companies for making a member of their class the bad guy, right, in a movie. What's the role that those kind of anti-defamation leagues play? And I would just add my own little piece. I'm really glad if there's one positive outcome of the Russia hoax stuff, it is that finally movies can make Russian communists the bad guy again. So Red Dawn, I think, is now back in style.
Rocky IV.
Yeah. No, but and I actually would add an additional part to your question, which I think is a great one. What about the influence of China and Chinese audiences in Hollywood? So go for it.
Oh, this is one of my pet peeves. I mean, does anybody here like Top Gun? Is anybody a Top Gun fan? Yeah, me too. Well, it turns out that because a Chinese company that we've allowed, this is what our country has allowed. We allow Chinese companies to come over here and finance major patriotic films like Top Gun and change the flag on the back of Tom Cruise's jacket. Now, I don't know, maybe that just happens to outrage me, but we cannot have a system, as we currently do, in which the Chinese Communist Party, look at LeBron James and I'm blanking on Steve Kerr and these other people carrying water for the Chinese Communist Party, who are the same people who hate the police, exactly as you were talking about. That's what the richest people in our country believe. They hate their own citizens. They act as lobbyists on behalf of their actual enemies. And so when you're going back what you're talking about, the I love that question, because what you're recognizing is that woke capital, as we just talked about, has allied itself with the cultural left in order to squeeze conservatives out of the conversation in anything whenever it comes to culture. And so the only way is to impose costs. Because what can the ADLs of all these different organizations do? They can get the New York Times and all these other media companies to write hit job articles against them, so they know that they're going to lose money. And what we did is we ceded that power over many, many years because we stopped believing in public policy. And we need to take it back again. We need to impose costs. And that requires everybody to come together and to actually start to believe in movements and in action again.
Yeah, I would just add, I think this question is somewhat related to the notion of cultural appropriation and who's allowed to tell what stories. So who's allowed to be the bad guy? Who's allowed to be the good guy? Who makes that decision? And today in Hollywood and in publishing, we have things like sensitivity readers who say well, this is going to trouble somebody or this won't. And the irony of this is that the entire concept of cultural appropriation is meant to decenter whiteness. Right? That's the purpose of it. But it actually does exactly the opposite. Because what happens is white culture, whatever you mean that to be, is absolutely open source. Nobody gets mad if Yo-Yo Ma plays the hell out of Bach. Nobody says how dare you play Bach, right? But every other culture becomes proprietary. And there are special rules about how you're able to portray people from these other cultures. And so it actually has exactly the exact opposite effect that these people want it to have, because it just puts people in a box, and the only people who aren't being put in a box are straight, white, Christian men, and they can play any role in the world. So I really just think they're missing the boat so badly on this.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions. So this is the sudden death round right here. I'm going to try this side of the room. Miss.
Hi. The title of this is Rampaging Through America, the Let's Take Over Our Culture. I would like to hear you guys talk about the hypocrisy. I live in flyover country, okay? And what gets people where I come from, where I live, is the fact that you turn on the television, people are talking out one side of their mouth and they're living a different life. All right, and if you would talk about how it is that we push back against that, and we start talking in a civil way, unlike the opposition, about the hypocrisy and that they're leading us down and trying to make people believe that the hypocrisy is real, because it's not.
So the question is, how do we expose, in a civil way, expose the hypocrisy of a lot of the people in control of these institutions, and versus how they live their lives is often very, very different from what they preach and what the rest of the country has to listen to. So how do we address or expose that hypocrisy?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Brooklyn.
That's just a laugh line by itself.
So, yeah. I live in a conservative part of Brooklyn to the extent that we have that, but I live in Brooklyn. I think the answer to that question is to try to decentralize our culture a little bit away from just the coasts. And I think you can probably speak to this, but the internet really is an opportunity to do that because, everybody, if you want to be in the arts or you want to be in the news media or you want to be in the positions where you have the power to be presenting what you're talking about, you're going to New York or LA or DC. I mean, that's where you go. So to break up those hubs a little bit, and maybe you can speak to the ability of the internet to do that.
I would say, ma'am, that what needs to happen is that the Republicans and the conservative establishment and all the people in Washington who have to live in the places and interact with the terrible people that you're talking about need to actually start caring more about what you think than they do about what they think. Because the secret is, and I'm sure you all know, how many fake Republicans do you see on TV or MSNBC, right? Who are all, talking heads, and they claim to speak on behalf of so many of you. They don't live like you. They don't want to even meet you. They actually hate the way that most of us live our lives. What needs to happen is, again, we need to impose costs. We need to impose costs on people who talk outside of one side of their mouth and live another. One of the biggest hypocrisies is so many of these people who are pushing and worshiping cultural values. You think they would ever let their kids get an abortion? No. Of course not. You think that they would ever let their kids, be a single mom and not impose major cultural costs upon them? No, but then they worship it for other communities. That's what needs to start happening, is that the people that you elect and the people that you donate to, the people that are supposed to fight for you, need to actually start fighting for you instead of caring more about what an MSNBC host thinks about them.
Okay. We got it. We have time for just one more question. So I think somebody's had their hand up the entire time. I think you have. Yeah. Let's go with you, and then we will be around afterwards. You can ask questions of the panelists afterwards.
Hi, my name is Inez, and actually this question was sparked because someone asked on the student side, what can students do if they're marked down for being a conservative? I'm actually a college professor at an inner city in Los Angeles, and for me, I'm a closeted conservative, but I'm trying to teach both sides of the issue. My question is to you is, liberal professors can openly share that they're liberal and sort of accepted, but when students ask me, oh, what do you think? And I always try to share both sides of the issue, I tell them, and I don't know if I'm self-silencing myself or I'm allowed to say that I am a conservative, but I didn't say that. I said, it doesn't matter what I think, what do you think? And I try to contribute to that critical thinking. So I just wanted to know, what are my rights as maybe your professor on the other side of this discussion? And second of all, your charge was, hey, be more active, be more active, take a stand for your beliefs. I was recently voted in as an Asian American Freedom PAC president, and I was hesitant because what if my college finds out that I'm a conservative? What if they find out that because I'm in this role as a spokesperson, and if I do more videos online, like what if I don't get asked back because I don't have a tenure track job, like I'm an adjunct professor, right? So what that means is you're asked to teach semester to semester with no benefits anyway. That's a totally another story, but what would you say to me? Because I've had friends who take a stand, like Gene Ho, he was the Trump campaign photographer. He lost his photography business because his wedding business, because everyone stopped wanting to work with him. Like, what would you say to people who have at stake something to lose from taking that stand? Would you still tell them, hey, keep doing it? Like, what's your advice?
So again, because I think the recording will be able to hear your questions. So we had a question from a conservative professor who wants to ask, first of all, what her rights are in terms of speaking her mind to students, the way that leftist professors do all the time. And two, what would your advice be to perhaps not just students, but professors or other people, and I want to broaden it from just the universities, other people, let's say in media or in the arts. There are enormous personal and professional costs to doing so. So how do we get more people to speak out when the professional costs and the personal costs can be so high, and how do we change that dynamic?
Well, that's definitely a fear that I think is probably the most mind-blowing part of my work at Young America's Foundation, is how many professors will send us stuff and say, you can't say where you got this, but I wanted you to know that this is happening. This is a communication that's gone out from the dean of my department to all the professors. I had no idea how, obviously I knew they were all leftists, but I had no idea how censorious they were even within the administration and with the faculty. And I think what you describe is the fact that just saying it doesn't matter what I believe, the left has gone so far that makes you now complicit with the other side, not taking picking a side makes you automatically just by default the enemy to them because you won't speak up and share exactly what they want you to say. And obviously that's problematic because what does that do? That chills speech, that chills dissent, that prevents any good ideas from rising to the top or new ideas from coming out. Definitely talk to me afterwards because there's a number of things we can help and do and talk to you through. But it's definitely a huge problem that we see not just with how faculty treat students, but with how faculty treats their own peers in the universities.
Does anybody have anything to add? Or okay. Well, in that case, wrap it up. Reagan's solution from that farewell address that I quoted at the beginning of this panel was for Americans to talk about these issues around their dinner tables. That answer just doesn't seem to cut it in 2020 from where we're sitting. But I think we've heard the beginning of some answers that do cut it this afternoon. So please thank our panelists, Spencer Brown, Saagar Enjeti, Dave Marcus, the Federalist, The Hill, YAF. I'm Inez Stepman from Independent Women's Forum, and thank you all for packing the house tonight for this such important conversation.